So let me welcome the first speaker, main author of the book, Dr. Greg Mills, for about 30 minutes. Please.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be with you all the way from Johannesburg in South Africa. I have to say this, I was a bit late in logging on, for which I apologize. But the reason why I was late in logging on was because I was doing a presentation on the book to the government of Kenya. So the book has had wider impacts, perhaps beyond our early anticipation and expectations. And people are very keen. There's a great appetite out there to learn from Asia's example and the power of its example, which I wish to share with you in terms of the summary of what the book is about and how we approached it this morning. So I have a short PowerPoint presentation, which I'm going to now test all of my abilities to be able to share with you, and hopefully this works. The book really focused, the methodology focused on focused on a question which was posed to me by Prime Minister Raila Odinga some years ago, when he said to me, why is it that in the 1960s we used to receive delegations from Asia, and he was talking in this context particularly about Singapore, and they were coming to Africa to learn from us. And then when he became Prime Minister in 2009, the delegations would come, well, many delegations would go from his country to Singapore as well as elsewhere in South Asia to learn the lessons of the intervening 50 years. And the answer really, we tried to write up in the book as to why the development experiences of the two regions have been so contrasting in terms of growth. It's not just a question of understanding what then Asia did, if one can put Asia into one single block, monolithic block, but it's also a question of asking why it is that Africa has done comparatively poor. So the book is structured around 10 chapters of 10 country case studies from Asia, starting with Japan as in a sense, the originator of the Asian development revolution, the starting point of it all, and then finishes up with Vietnam as perhaps the most recent example. We don't try and cover every country. We don't try and cover everything that every country did either. So we focus in each case on a particular set of features, and I'll highlight some of these which I think have relevance for an African audience. And then we have 5 chapters which look at the relevance and entwine the relevance with what the African circumstance is, and looks at African circumstances and what one would do in those circumstances if one approached this from an Asian perspective. This is based also thus on 2 other books which we have written over the past 3 years. Making Africa Work, which was really a focus on the economics of transitions and of economic transitions in Africa, and then Democracy Works, which came out about 18 months ago, which looked at the political aspects of transition and why there's this very clear correlation between development and democracy and the quality of democracy in particular in Africa. And then those, of course, built into this book, the Asian Aspiration, why and how Africa should emulate Asia. At the start, I think it's very important to understand why this is important for Africa. It's important because of 6 factors, we think, which is how do we get African growth rates at the levels, to the levels that Asia managed, something around about 8% per annum, to create the sort of jobs that we need, secondly, to be able to develop in our societies so that we can ensure a demographic dividend as our population doubles over the next generation. Africa's population is going from around 1.25 billion today to around 2.5 billion people in all of Africa, 2 billion people in sub-Saharan Africa over the next 30 years. Most Africans are going to be living in cities over the next decade. How do we ensure that we put in place the conditions, the infrastructure conditions, the policy conditions, the planning and management conditions to be able to ensure that we enjoy the economies of scale that, for example, Asia's been able to create in a developmental context for itself? How do we use technology to our advantage? The fact that we're talking to you today via Zoom is a 2020 example, perhaps a COVID example, unfortunately, of the power of technology. But it does point out that if you don't have bandwidth, very simply, it's very hard to do business today. But there are downside impacts of technology. There are challenging aspects, and not least in terms of whether it allows African countries to follow the same development route that Asia did in terms of light manufacturing. Or is that avenue now closed off to us? There's a fifth aspect to this, which I've already highlighted, which is this question of democracy. Democracies do better at governance overall in Africa. It's quite different in a sense to the Asian position, not different, of course, to the Japanese one. And one of the challenges that we have in this book is coming up with kind of Africa-wide pronouncements, just as it is difficult coming up with Asia-wide pronouncements, which is why we attempt through the different country case studies a level of differentiation. But generally speaking, the record in Africa is that the better the democracy, as I've said, the better the development record. There are exceptions to this, but generally speaking, a movement towards a democratic system of government is better for reasons of accountability and competitiveness and of governance, which I'm sure the former Prime Minister will talk about. And then finally, is what lessons does this mean for outsiders and insiders alike, but outsiders in terms of donors and investors? How can they operate in these environments, in particular in the African environment? And what lessons can we draw, particularly from the way in which donor money was used to spur development in Asia? I would just say at the outset that it's an unusual combination of co-authors, two foremost African statesmen and two South African-based academics, one an economist, myself, I guess you'd call me by now a political economist, but started off life as a political scientist. And I do believe that the outcome draws on our varied experiences. How difficult it is to match the theoretical with the practical. It's great to have ideas as academics, but how do you actually enable them to have traction, to enable them to take root is, of course, a policy challenge. And there are no better people to work with in this regard as President Obasanjo and Prime Minister Haile Mariam, who are able to impart years of governmental experience. And I have to say, what a pleasure it is as an academic to work with statesmen who are willing to lend their experiences to others, so we can improve our craft, our trade as policy analysts and as academics, that we don't just write about the theoretical, but that we write about the theoretical that can be practically implemented in developmental contexts. So what did we find in our country case studies? Well, all of our analysis was driven really by this quite staggering chart, which is the average share of Africans relative in per capita income terms to global per capita income averages, where we started off at roughly the same level as Asia in 1960, 60 years ago, of course, and we have widely diverged since that time. We've got little over half as rich as we used to be if measured in terms of global averages, and Asia has improved its income threefold during the course of the intervening 6 decades. And that tells its own story, but it tells a story of the costs of conflict, of the costs of the relative absence of regional growth and the ability to feed off it. It tells a story of relative lack of integration of the global economy, both for reasons of policy as well as reasons for hard infrastructure. It tells a story of the failure of policy. It tells a story of the prevalence of conflict. It tells a story of the challenges of leadership. And some of those things I will talk to you about this morning before handing over to the Prime Minister. Now, you could sort of easily say, oh, well, it tells a story about relative governance. Yes, it does. But we were, in fact, more interested in the underlying features of what leads to relative poor scores in governance, as indicated by this chart of the World Bank's, which is quite clear in terms of governance effectiveness up the vertical axis and per capita income on the horizontal axis. And most of the poorly performing African countries are clustered around the intersection at the bottom, and the higher performing countries, of course, at the top, like Singapore. This you can see in terms of the measurement of doing business indicators. Most African countries are in the lowest quartile, and most Asian countries are in the top 2 quartiles in terms of governance effectiveness. But again, the question is moot. Why did we get there? And why haven't we moved out of these quartiles more rapidly as Asia has done? And this raises the point as to why we would want to be like Asia. What is attractive about the Asian record? Well, the first thing that's attractive is, of course, that Africa today has now the largest store of poor people in the world. And the reason why is that we've not been able to address poverty at the same rates as Asia, and in particular China, which, as China has shed poverty, before COVID at least, we will have to see what the statistics tell us after COVID, but has shed or lifted huge numbers of people out of poverty. Africans have remained in that position, and thus we've become the continent with the most poor people. The growth methodology of Asia is very attractive. Growing through manufactures and exports, as was started by Japan and then replicated in, excuse me, some shape and form by the Tigers and Cubs and others. In a sense, accessing a wealthier importing market outside is ostensibly the model. So it's all about a model of low-cost production, in skilling a workforce, capital investments, and then improving integration logistically, particularly with the global economy. The Asian commitment to popular welfare, in spite of the relative absence of democracy, is impressive. That leaders feel responsive to the needs of their people, not just responsive to the needs of elites, as Haile Miriam, I'm sure, will say, the rent seekers, but responsive to the needs of their populations, and which they were able to do despite levels of corruption and authoritarianism. Because you have low unemployment, because you have high skills development, and because you have constantly improving human development index indicators, this makes you too attractive as a model for Africa. And in fact, the fact that much of the development change, not Japan, of course, but much of the development change in Asia has happened over a 60-year period in our lifetimes, make it identifiable to policymakers today. We've actually seen it happening. It's been a real-time experience. American growth, happened mostly in the 19th and early 20th century of the sort that we're talking about. Britain even earlier, other parts in Europe similarly, but in Asia, it's a living experience, and thus we can relate to it far more easily. And of course, We want to be like Asia because it's all about stable foreign investment, creating in all of this opportunities for large numbers of people. As I've mentioned, population projections in Africa are frightening, but only frightening if we don't do something about it. If we can prepare for this extraordinary demographic change that we are about to undertake or experience, we can in fact achieve a demographic dividend, which is this influx of large numbers of young people into our economies simultaneously with the creation of skills and thus jobs and a greater share of the global economy. We wrote it because, as I've already mentioned, we're at a crossroads. It's important for our leaders to choose development which is not just of a redistributive kind, but of a sustainable kind. Because if we don't do this, the sorts of youth revolutions that we've seen, particularly in North Africa in the last decade, could be upon us in many African environments, particularly in an urban setting. And we argue in this book that there are surprising similarities sometimes in history and in context. In fact, we can relate, as I said earlier, to the Asian experience. We can relate to the fact that it's not from Europe, it's from Asia, and we have seen this unfold in our lifetimes. So this all led to a very central question, which I'm going to whisk through very quickly, which is how did Asia do it from our vantage and what Africa can learn. And here there are 5 key, you'll have to forgive my slide in this context, 5 key takeaways. The first of these, and you'll all be familiar with that picture that I took this time last year, is it takes a long time. I think Lee Kuan Yew once said to President Obasanjo, and this is one of the great joys of writing with a statesman of his caliber, he's had the exchanges with these leading statesmen in Asia, amongst other places. He once said that it was no miracle, he did a few things right, he kept doing them right, widening and deepening all the time. It's a development process that is over generations, and you layer it continuously. It's like the building of an onion. The layers and layers and layers are set upon each other. And of course, we are only too familiar that the history of Japan is really, the modern history of Japan started in the mid-19th century with the sorts of educational changes and then the openness to the international community in terms of technology, which inspired many other countries to follow that route later on in the 20th century. The second big takeaway is that success demands difficult trade-offs and priorities setting and very hard choices. One of the features of African development agendas is their length. Simply, they have hundreds of priorities. And one of the reasons I would argue that there are hundreds of priorities is not just because of need, but it's also because of the way in which donors engage, is that African governments produce long lists of priorities because every donor can take something away. So they're less about what it is that Africa wants to do than what Africa thinks that the donors might fund. And in that rather obtuse, indirect way, the development agenda is set from outside. Fundamentally, a third big lesson is that you need a strong private sector for growth and development. And it's not the state's role to sort of create it to be able to profit from it. It's the state's role to create that space, to celebrate the private sector and be able to appreciate the benefits of private investment, not reluctantly prise its fingers off what it considers to be great state assets and never letting go of its grip, but actually willingly engage with the private sector to create partners in this process and to celebrate the success which emanates. Absolutely, competitiveness is key, and that's built on the bedrock of education, a key lesson from Japan in particular. Not all of the lessons finally are worth learning. Well, excuse me, they're worth learning, but they're worth avoiding, particularly the lessons of authoritarianism in parts of Asia and the environmental consequences that we see from the sorts of rapid, rampant even, growth in parts of Asia. And as I said, the authoritarianism is something that the majority of African countries and peoples already reject. Let me turn to some country-specific observations before making some conclusions. The principal lesson we took out, as I said, these 10 country case studies, and I'm not going to deal with every country case study this morning, is the country case studies, we picked up on a particular theme. And the lesson we saw from Japan, which was most relevant, was this importance of sustainability, this importance of continuous innovation, learn, translate, adapt were the words that kind of struck us most from the Japanese example. An example which was dependent on a very thick layer of human capital, but also on openness to the outside world. I was recently listening to a presentation by the Malawi vice president where he said, basically, we need to come up with our own solutions. We don't want solutions from outside. Well, in fact, that's not the example of Asia. The example of Asia is about borrowing lessons from outside, about taking technology from Britain, loom technology if you were Toyota or Suzuki, or motorcycle technology if you were Honda, and then using this in your own way and adapting it and building on it and perfecting it and then developing from that base. There's nothing wrong with that. That's the stuff on which successful innovation is often created. And this terminology of translative adaptation is part and parcel of this. In other words, be open to ideas from outside, build a very successful education system which is highly competitive, and you will reap the dividends. Taiwan, of course, very closely followed in some respects the early Japanese model, but of course, given its political difficulties or unusual circumstances, it's gone off in a slightly different direction. Of course, it's highly competitive, just as other Asian countries have become, and it's followed a development path from our vantage, which started, of course, with the Land to the Tiller program, started with using foreign aid very effectively, and then developed through these different stages, through light industry, petrochemicals, and now into IT. But very much a story today about taking advantage of the global value chain. Singapore is one, as my comment about the former Prime Minister Raila Odinga suggests, of not becoming a prisoner to your past, a hostage to history. And in fact, that's a general lesson that one can take out of the successful examples of Asia for Africa. Not spending too much time, as Henry Kissinger would put it, looking at the rearview mirror or through the rearview mirror, but looking through the windscreen, because that's the direction you want to head in. Of course, it's a story of, again, openness to outsiders, both in terms of ideas. The fact that Albert Finsemius was the economic advisor there for a long time is one illustration. Another is the way in which Singapore used its location and its putting in place the conditions to attract multinational corporations is another. It matched very carefully what it said it was going to do with what it did. And too often in Africa, we have these long lists of things promised by politicians, Kylie Miriam excluded, promised by politicians, but never delivered on. And they lose credibility as a consequence of this. As Lee Kuan Yew said to President Obasanjo, we did a few things right, kept on doing them right, widening and deepening all the time. And it's not just down to authoritarianism. Many Africans say that Singapore is an illustration of what you can do with a benevolent dictatorship. Well, in Africa, the words benevolent and dictator are an oxymoron together. They generally don't go well together. There are one or two exceptions of high growth rates under authoritarians, but generally our rule is that these examples all end badly because there's no succession planning, there's lack of competition ultimately, and oversight in terms of governance. South Korea is a story of incentivizing competitiveness, a country that was much poorer in the early 1960s than most African countries. Park, together with a measure of fairly heavy-handed at times, repression or encouragement, let's say, of his commercial leaders, plus an incentivization of those that exported, led to this tremendous growth upsurge, not only leaving Africa behind, but also leaving the north of Korea behind at the same time. There were very deliberate choices made in this, but again, the important lesson is that this was not just one story of a strong man who did things and did things his way, and that was it. It was actually about a system that was put in place, which was a system of incentivization. The Philippines is a bit of a contra-example. It's one where, and I had lunch with the lady on the left there in the course of writing this book. It's an example of the dangers of rent-seeking elites. It's a story of the dangers of elite mismanagement, of a boom and bust economy, which very reluctantly liberalizes, is very much African in terms of its reliance on commodities, on a crony capitalist environment. And we see some of these similar tendencies today in the area of Duterteism, of populism, put it differently, which are concerning. And this, of course, is in part due to its legacy, in part due to its role in the Cold War in particular, and its support by outside forces, notably the United States. And in a sense, it's an exceptional example in the context of what we studied. Malaysia is somewhere in between the very high growth, highly diversified, highly competitive examples. It used infrastructure very successfully. There was a strong focus on education. There is, of course, high levels, relatively speaking, of commodity dependence. And it's an example that we have focused a great deal on in South Africa because of its job preferences on the grounds of race. And most of the politicians that we spoke to, notably Anwar Ibrahim, but in an earlier time also Mahathir, have sort of decried the fact that the Bumiputra system has led to relative inefficiencies and a lack of competitiveness. It's institutionalized a rent-seeking culture. Indonesia is again a little like for the Philippines in parts, but does overall illustrate the benefits of growth. Of course, it's a country where there are very historic parallels made with Nigeria, but in spite of that, there's been this continuous growth imperative, not just a dependency on a single commodity in oil, but a driving an agenda for diversification, even during the Suharto period, when there was relative improvements in governance and in foreign investment. Again, a pattern starting through light manufacturers and ending today in areas of IT. But the interesting feature for me was perhaps slightly different, is that while people were willing to tolerate Suharto as long as things were going relatively well, when in a sense the country outgrew his brand of politics, and particularly the middle class concerns outgrew his authoritarianism, Indonesia transformed to a different system. Thailand, which of course has been much in the news, is an example of relatively closed politics, but an open system in terms of visitors, which have been a key part in its economic success. We would argue that although it's enjoyed remarkable reductions in poverty, it probably hasn't fully realized its potential because of this overwhelming feature of political uncertainty. And there have been certain missed opportunities along the way. Interestingly, of course, it's part of the regional effect of growth, the flying geese effect of growth, as it's termed, of rising cost elsewhere, notably, of course, in Japan, and then economic diversification on the back of that. China, of course, is the big story. It's the story that everyone in Africa focuses on, not least because of China's involvement in the African continent over the last 25 years. This very aggressive posture towards Africa in terms of investment and aid, or a form of aid. It's loans rather than grants. And of course, its engagement through the Belt and Road Initiative. But it is, of course, a story of policy change, particularly by Deng Xiaoping, as epitomized by his cats and mice statement of a generation ago. It's a story of massive infrastructure-led growth, as this picture from the top of the tower in Shanghai illustrates, where we were with the engineer who designed the first overpass. There were only a few kilometers back in 1989. Today, it's a city in Shanghai of overpasses. And it's a country which is continuously measured in superlatives. And because it's measured in superlatives by many in Africa who benefited from exposure to this model, they forget often where it comes from. This was a story of development in enclaves. As Justin Lin pointed out to us when we interviewed him in Beijing, they started small in special economic zones, in fact, learning from countries like Mauritius. And then they gradually built this outwards. Of course, there are concerns for us in terms of the cost of unsustainable growth, but it's really a model which, like the following and last one, illustrates the power of policy change. And that's Vietnam, a country that I've been fortunate to travel to since 1994, a country which basically used its policy tools that it had at its disposal to go from a closed command economy through Doi Moi in the mid-1980s to what we know today. And we were fortunate, myself and the Prime Minister and Emily and President Obasanjo, to visit a number of these development zones, extraordinary in terms of their scale. Of course, there's questions about what next in Vietnam. You can't stay in that low-cost manufacturing space forever. You're seeing this already in terms of the transition of some of these IDZs into higher value addition goods. And of course, this illustrates the importance of using outside resources very well. The famous story of Japanese aid over the bridge, which is quite a contrast to the history of aid expenditure in many places in Africa. But again, like Singapore, all of this illustrating the importance of not being a prisoner of your past. So let me, in conclusion, the last two slides, simply say, if we were to take, in simple terms, the examples from Asia for Africa, we would say it's a story of being open. It's a story of gaining a bigger slice of the global market outside. Of course, you need the basics. You need stability. You need macroeconomic stability. You need a competitive exchange rate that matches real value. You need the right set of infrastructure and the prioritization of it. You must be open to talent. You must be open to ideas. You must be able to listen to business. You must be willing to celebrate business. And I come from a country where celebrating business is undesirable, in part because of our history, in part because it's sort of frowned on, in a sense, to be wealthy. The importance of improving productivity and of governance. And then I think absolutely critical are these last two factors: the need for speed, the need to act decisively, the need to do the things that you say you're going to do, not just have a long list of priorities, but actually fundamentally that everything is measured through the prism of whether it helps to create jobs. Is this policy action going to help us to create more jobs in our country? I think, for me, is a key lesson out of Asia. And what Africa shouldn't do, conversely, is about focusing on commodity-led growth alone, is mistaking trade for development and investment. We want foreign direct investment. We don't just want people to trade with us. It's part of it. It's part of the story, but it's not the full part of the story. You can't develop without uplifting the poor. You've got to provide the ladder through which this can occur, of course. And the sort of state-led ladder is part of it, but it's clearly only just that, a part of it. Don't try and pick winners. There's a great poverty of picking winners across Southeast Asia. And this is something particularly the Singaporeans always mention. Don't ignore the environment. We're seeing some of the costs of rampant environmental degradation in parts of East Asia. You must focus not just on income alone, but just also on improving the quality of life, and spread the love outside the cities as well. Ensure that rural development strategies are part and parcel of the answer. And then don't think, finally, that authoritarianism is going to deliver. Our history in Africa is authoritarianism is even worse than democracy in terms of its weaknesses and frailties. So let me end there and hand over to the Prime Minister, but just to say that, you know, writing two things, writing a book with Prime Minister Haile Mariam and President Obasanjo is a little like playing guitar with Bob Dylan. You don't always get to do it, but it's hell of a good fun if you do, and it's greatly fulfilling. And let me also say the second thing, which is what a pleasure it is as an African to spend time in Asia where you see this, the benefits of continuous growth over several generations. And that's why it's so important for us to strive for this. If you have 60 years of continuous high-level growth, you have this extraordinary compounding effect on people and on poverty. And that's the power of the Asian example. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Greg Mills, for very rich in context and also thoughtful and also beautiful presentation. We really appreciate it.